Okay, great. So I think we'll just go ahead and get started. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. Always fun in this age. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen just for a few notes. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. We are so excited to have everyone. So today we're doing the Trainee Research Presentation Blitz. This is, I think, almost the third or fourth one that we've done actually. So we've been organizing them every few months, and it's just an opportunity for everyone from master's students all the way up to postdocs to share what they're working on and be able to do some knowledge translation, as well as an opportunity to practice presentation skills. So it's fairly informal, but we've had some pretty amazing speakers in the past, so we're so excited today. We've got some really interesting topics. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I also recognize that not everyone is joining us today from beautiful Vancouver. So if everyone could just take a moment to, even if it's just for one breath, just to think about the land that you currently occupy and just have a moment of gratitude for that. So I'll take a breath too. Great. Okay. And also before we begin, just like to thank a few sponsors. So this is supported by the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research, as well as CHR. And then we also had a very large gift from Dr. Elizabeth Rideout to support this, as well as a few other initiatives for the Women's Health Research Cluster. And we'd love it if you tweet today, so tag #TraineeBlitz. Also make sure you follow us on Twitter, and feel free to reach out to us, and yeah, just love to see some tweets about the event. And today also we're going to do so 5 minutes for each presentation, 3 minutes for questions. And what we would like for you to do is, if you have a question, what we will try is if you can use the emoji to raise your hand, and then I or Catherine will unmute you, and then you can just directly ask your question. And if we have any issues with that, then we also have the Slido code here, 20359, which I can repeat again later on if we're having issues with that. So that's just our backup, but we'd really love it if people just are able to just raise their hand, and then we can unmute you and you can have a quick question just directly to the speakers. So without further ado, and since we started a little late, let's get started. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and Natalie, I think you're up first. So if we can have you start to share your screen, and then I'm just going to do a quick introduction for Natalie. Oops, you here. Okay. So Natalie Brown is a PhD student in the UBC Clinical Psychology program, working under the supervision of Doctors Laurie Brotto and Alan Kingstone. She completed her Master's in Arts in Clinical Psychology at UBC, and her thesis explored the cognitive mechanisms underlying sexual attraction and desire, with a specific focus on asexuality and sexual interest / arousal disorder. She's also involved in Immersive, a study investigating women's subjective sexual responses to virtual reality, erotica. And she plans to evaluate VR as a clinical tool for the treatment of genitopelvic pain penetration disorder, or GPPPD, in her PhD. Natalie is also one of the coordinators of the COVER study, which investigates the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19 related social changes on sexual and reproductive health. Overall, her research program aims to improve our understanding of sexual difficulties and develop evidence-based interventions for individuals with distressing sexual concerns. So welcome, Natalie, and take it away.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great. And tell me you can see my slides and not my notes. Yeah, wonderful. All right, hi everyone, my name is Natalie, and I'll be presenting my MA thesis assessing different presentations of low desire and eye tracking investigation. So for background, asexuality is generally defined as a sexual orientation characterized by a lack of sexual attraction to others, forgive my cat, and ace folks make up about 1% of the general population. So they're often told that they are unnatural or broken, and some clinicians have actually challenged asexuality as unique sexual orientation, arguing that ace folks suffer from an extreme form of the sexual desire disorder. So that brings us to sexual interest arousal disorder, or SIAD, defined as an absence or reduction in sexual desire or arousal that's lasted at least 6 months, which affected women associate with significant distress. So there's two subtypes. So women with lifelong SIAD report always having experienced distressing sexual concerns, whereas for those with acquired SIAD, the sexual concerns appear after a period of satisfactory desire or arousal. Unfortunately, the majority of studies focus on women with acquired SIAD, and as a result, we know very little about lifelong SIAD and how the two subtypes differ. So we have evidence to suggest that asexuality and acquired SIAD are separate entities, but women with lifelong SIAD report similarly low levels of desire, frequency of sexual behavior, and long-standing disinterest in sex, suggesting possible overlap between these groups. So research does suggest that unique neural mechanisms underlie asexuality and SIAD. However, only one study has directly compared these groups, and none have looked at their cognitive processing of sexual cues. And so that is what we set out to do. So we compared the cognitive processing of sexual cues in these groups through an investigation of their visual attention to sexual stimuli through eye tracking in order to better understand whether asexuality and SIAD are separate entities, and also to examine differences between women with different SIAD subtypes. So moving on to methods, so I recruited 42 asexual individuals, 9 heterosexual women with lifelong SIAD, and 16 heterosexual women with acquired SIAD. My sample is smaller than anticipated due to COVID-19, fun times. So for procedures and measures, I conducted a brief phone screen to determine study eligibility. Prior to the in-lab session, participants completed a demographic survey via Qualtrics. And for the in-lab session, first the eye tracker was calibrated, and the force attention paradigm began with a fixation cross that showed up in the middle of the screen. Once the participant fixated on it, 2 images appeared. We had an erotic image depicting a nude heterosexual couple engaging in sexual activity, and there's also a neutral image featuring a clothed man and woman. So images were shown for 10 seconds. There were 20 trials. For data analysis, I conducted a series of one-way ANOVAs. Group served as the independent variable, and the dependent variables were various eye tracking outcomes. So there were 4 DVs based on measure of attention and region of interest, or ROI. So measure of attention included the number of fixations, so that's how often you look at something, or the dwell time, that's how long you look at a stimulus. And so I calculated various proportional variables based on the ROI. So first, I calculated the proportion of fixations and dwell time to the erotic image relative to both images. And second, the proportion of fixations and dwell time to the area of sexual contact relative to the entire screen. So moving on to results, when examining the proportion of fixations and dwell time to the erotic relative to the non-erotic image shown on the y-axis there, group is on the x-axis, we did find a main effective group such that asexual individuals had a lower proportion of fixations and dwell time to the erotic image relative to women with both SIAD subtypes. And differences between ace groups and the SIAD groups were large in magnitude. So generally, women with SIAD gazed preferentially at erotic images. So a similar pattern emerged for gaze to the area of sexual contact. So that would be the area of either oral genital contact or penile vaginal penetration. So there was a main effective group so that asexual individuals had a lower proportion of fixations and dwell time to that area relative to women with both SIAD subtypes. Once again, differences were large in magnitude. And it should be noted that there were no differences between SIAD groups for any of the eye tracking outcomes that we looked at. And then in terms of, am I over time? No, we're good. Okay. And so in terms of summary interpretation, so women with SIAD demonstrated a sex-specific bias, preferentially gazing at erotic images in areas of sexual contact, whereas asexual participants did not. So focusing on ace folks, considering a body of research suggesting that controlled attention is in line with our sexual attractions, these findings really provide empirical evidence for their lack of sexual attraction to others. And for implications for clinical practice, really our findings suggest that lifelong SIAD and asexuality are distinct. Differentiating these two entities is still difficult for clinicians. And so we encourage that when individuals come in presenting with lifelong no desire, that clinicians really give them information about asexuality and connect them with local ace groups so that they can really explore that identity. And I'm done.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie. Great work. Okay, so again, I'll just kind of reiterate, if you have a question, if you would mind just putting your hand up. I'm not, not the clappy version, but the hand up version. If you have a question, and I'll unmute you. I can ask a quick question. Just so, what would be like in terms of like for clinicians, like in terms of distinction for the two? Like, is there like a question that people would ask that came up that is normally like to distinguish between the two groups?
Such a tough question. There is, so typically what we really look at is distress. So we find that ace folks generally aren't distressed by their lack of sexual desire, whereas women with lifelong SIAD are really distressed and they really want it to change. That question though becomes problematic in that some ace folks, before they hear about asexuality, they are distressed because society tends to really focus on sexual norms and they might really want to have romantic relationships, and sex happens to be a part of that for many people. So you have to be really careful in distinguishing the source of the distress when you're asking those questions. And so we're hoping to give some clinicians some more guidance on how to carefully do that.
Great, very great work.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, in the interest of time, we might move on if no one else has any burning questions. But also, just remember, we can we'll post on the website everyone's Twitter handles and probably contact information. So if you have follow-up for the speakers, just make sure you just like look at the Women's Health Research Cluster website, and you can connect individually. So next up, we'll have Kara share your screen, and I'll just introduce you real quick. Okay, so Kara attended Western University from 2016 to 2020. Where she got her bachelor's degree in health sciences and developed an unfortunate dependency on coffee. That sounds familiar. Her research interests revolve around women's health, including topics like breastfeeding, maternal infant health, and intimate partner violence. The thesis of her master's examines influences of income experiences of intimate partner violence during COVID-19 pandemic. She is also working on side projects regarding maternal decision-making regarding a COVID-19 vaccine for children and the unique health impacts faced by women with disabilities who experience violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. Kara is supported by the Ontario Graduate Scholarship, and again, copious amounts of coffee. Me too. Okay, take it away, Kara. Thanks.
So just to confirm, everyone can hear me okay, and my slide is on the screen. Okay, so my name is Kara, as Alex mentioned, and I am working in collaboration with the Women's Health Matters Research Lab at Western University on the Empower study, which is looking at the impacts of COVID-19 physical distancing on women who are experiencing intimate partner violence at home in Canada. And I know that is a mouthful, but I'm gonna walk you through it. So the goal of this study is kind of twofold. So first and foremost, it is a needs assessment. And the first part of that is understanding how women who experience IPV at home actually survived the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the second part to that is identifying what these women need and want to support their coping and surviving to help them build resilience during future waves. Now, unfortunately, the process of research is a lot slower than the pandemic, which is moving very quickly, at least in Ontario. We're already at the second wave and we haven't quite made it to even data analysis quite yet in its completion. But I guess the bittersweet news is that COVID will probably have multiple waves and we hope to get this research out into the world before the very end of this. So just to be clear, when I'm talking about intimate partner violence, I am talking about any form of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse within the context of coercive control by an intimate partner. The key word there is coercive control. So when you're thinking about IPV, and then the reason why we're interested in IPV in the context of COVID-19 is because we know that rates of IPV tend to increase during any type of personal, family, and/or collective emergency. And we know already just from personal experience, I'm sure, that COVID has impacts in each of these areas, in your personal life, in your family, and as society as a whole, which leaves quite a bit of opportunity for rates of IPV to increase. And we're actually already seeing preliminary reports that are confirming this with COVID-19. We saw this coming out of China first, obviously, and then even into the US and the UK, and we're starting to get some speculation in Canada as well. So our methods for this study, we used mixed methods, so a survey and then qualitative interviews. So the survey hoped to identify correlations between the type of IPV these women were experiencing, as well as their employment and physical distancing measures. When we're talking about employment, this is important because COVID-19 really disrupted the job market. So a lot of people had to move to part-time work, or if you were an essential worker, your life might have been turned upside down. And we also wanted to identify and quantify relative risk ratios to determine if violence did increase for women living at home with an abusive partner during COVID-19, as we suspected. So we've got about 90 participants in this survey, so it's a decent number, but nothing too big. And in terms of interviews, we were focusing exclusively on the coping and resilience part of this project. So identifying what worked for you in the first wave and what would help you in the second and future waves, as well as in future pandemics. And then we broke down the interviews into rural and urban women, and there's a reason behind this. Experiences of IPV are actually very different geographically, and it's as simple as access to services and the magnitude of your social circle. And we see in the literature, there's quite distinct differences between rural and urban women in terms of IPV. Okay, so the significance of the project and the point of doing this was to quantify the trends of intimate partner violence during COVID-19, because again, we have a lot of speculation, we just don't have the data quite yet to back that up. And then the second part of it is identifying how women cope during COVID-19. And this is important because the goal of a needs assessment is never to prescribe a solution, it's to work collaboratively with the community to develop one. So that's what we're hoping to do. And then hopefully those two pieces can fit together quite nicely to come up with a series of guidelines to identify the goals, needs, and resources required to better support these women in future waves as well as future pandemics. And then just some preliminary findings. As I mentioned, we are not done with data analysis nor collection, but we're already seeing a couple things emerging, especially in the interviews. And one of the things that has really stood out to me so far is that abusers are really manipulating distancing measures. So again, I talked about the importance of coercive control, and it appears that abusers are really using that to isolate their partners from their broader social circles, from their employment, and trying to keep them at home where it's much easier to control them. Another thing that we're seeing is that financial and social support are being identified time and time again as key to their coping and resilience. And from what I've heard so far, it seems that this is related to having the resources to escape. So do you have someone to help you plan leaving? Do you have the finances to actually do that? And that kind of support can make all the difference in the safety for these women. And then finally, what women would have done differently. I've heard quite a bit that they would have left. But I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, at least in Ontario, we were saying, okay, we'll shut it down for 2 weeks. And no one was thinking this would be months and months and months of like all over the place, everything shut down. And so looking back, a lot of these women are saying, you know what, if I had known I would be stuck at home for months on end, I would have left had I had the financial and social support. So it all kind of ties together. And that's everything I have. My contact information is on the page if you think of a question after the question period or just want to keep up with my work. Thanks.
Awesome, great job, Kara. It's such an important issue for sure. Yeah. So I realized actually, so there's a clap emoji and there's a thumbs up emoji. So there's actually there is no little hand up emoji. So awesome for the claps. Give the speakers lots of love for their hard work. But if you have a question, do the thumbs up emoji. So let's keep that clear. Oh, these little things. Any questions at all for Kara? No?
If you're curious, maybe not about this, but about another project, I'm working on one, as Alex mentioned in my bio, about COVID-19 and maternal decision-making about potential COVID-19 vaccine for children. So if that's more up your alley, you can also talk about that.
Yeah, awesome. Sounds good. I don't want to be the only person asking questions. I'll just ask a really quick one. What was the biggest difference between the rural and urban finding?
So again, data analysis or collection is ongoing, and we're having a hard time actually getting rural participants just because we're recruiting through Kijiji, and Kijiji, because it wants you to get the most responses possible, will always kind of cluster you in an urban place. So we're having a bit of trouble with that, so I can't really comment yet. Sorry.
No, that's not good. All right, no worries. Yeah, like, and if again, if you have other questions, just get in touch. But I think we'll move on. But thank you so much, Kara. That was excellent.
Thanks.
Okay, so next up we'll do Sabrina. So Sabrina, if you would mind sharing your screen, and then I'll introduce you. All right, so Sabrina G. So Sabrina obtained her Bachelor's of Science in Integrated Science, Psychology, and Microbiology from UBC. Her interests lie in investigating factors that may confer vulnerability to depression, including changes in sex hormone levels, deficits in hedonic and reward processing, as well as perfectionistic personality traits and interpersonal behaviors. So we're really excited to have you here, Sabrina, and I'll let you go for it there.
Great, thank you, Alex. Can you see my notes or just the screen?
Just the screen.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm Sabrina, and today I'm going to be discussing a project that's currently ongoing at the Social Health Lab at UBC. And we are investigating the impact of hormonal contraceptive use on adolescent reward processing. So in Canada, oral contraceptives are very popular amongst young women. In 2015, approximately 30% of teen girls between the ages of 15 to 19 were taking these hormonal pills. The most commonly used hormonal contraceptive is the combined hormonal contraceptive, which is made with a combination of synthetic estrogen and progesterone. So here's a graph that shows the natural fluctuations we typically see in the human body. So in red, you see estrogen levels, and in blue, you see progesterone levels. When women take CHCs, or hormonal contraceptives, synthetic forms of estrogen and progesterone are introduced to the body, which suppresses the natural production of these hormones and changes the hormone profile of these women, which you can see here. Adolescence is a critical period for development and maturation of the brain. One thing that happens to girls during puberty is an increase in estrogen and progesterone levels. These sex hormones are important for regulating various regions and systems of the brain that are related to reward processing. So taking CHCs during adolescence leads to dramatic changes in sex hormone levels, which may interfere with important processes that occur naturally during puberty and lead to long-term consequences. So studying reward processing is particularly important because blunted reward responses have been closely linked with anhedonia, which is a core symptom of depression. The current literature on reward processing and hormonal contraceptive use is limited. 2 task-based fMRI studies found that adults who were using hormonal contraceptives exhibited greater neural responses when viewing images of food and when expecting monetary rewards. However, there's no study that has investigated whether these findings in adults hold true in adolescents. And in addition, there are no longitudinal studies that have investigated the long-term implications of hormonal contraceptive use in adolescents on reward processing. So this is the gap in knowledge that we're hoping to address. So given the key role that sex hormones play in adolescent development and reward processing, and the emerging evidence pointing to hormonal contraceptives' impact on altering reward response in adults, we predict that hormonal contraceptive use in adolescents will lead to short and long-term alterations in reward processing. So our sample will consist of 320 13 to 15-year-old girls who have had their first period and who have never previously used hormonal contraceptives. Participants will be assessed at 3 time points at 18-month intervals. At each time point, we'll ask the participant about their current hormonal contraceptive use, and we'll also assess for reward processing, which we'll be doing using the Humor Rewards task. So this task assesses 2 components of reward processing. It assesses motivation, which is how badly you want a reward, and enjoyment, so how much you actually like the reward. And the reward in this task is a funny cartoon. Participants will be shown 10 funny and 10 neutral cartoons and then asked to rate how much they enjoy each one. Then motivation will be measured by assessing how much participants are willing to work to view a funny cartoon. So for example, when participants, the participant will have to choose between a funny or a neutral deck, but they must complete the associated click cost before viewing the cartoon from that chosen deck. So if a participant clicks on the funny deck, then they would have to click on a moving square 20 times before they can view that funny cartoon. So with each subsequent trial, the click cost for the funny cartoon will increase. So the greater the amount of times the participant is willing to click on a moving square to view a funny cartoon, the greater their motivation. We expect that adolescents will differ in their enjoyment and motivation for rewards. We'll assess between subject effects, so whether hormonal contraceptive using and non-using adolescents differ. And then we'll also assess within subject effects. So whether teens who begin taking CHC pills show significant differences in reward processing over time. Great, so it's critical that prospective studies assess the long-term impact of CHC use on adolescents' reward processing, as alterations in reward responses have been closely linked with depressive symptoms. Our research will hopefully elucidate the effect of hormonal contraceptive use on adolescent reward responses and allow for future young patients and their families to make a more informed decision when deciding whether or not to begin taking hormonal contraceptives in adolescence. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. This is huge. This is so big, I feel like, and it's such an understudied area, I think.
Yes.
Really. That's great. Good job. So I'll leave it open for questions. So do the thumbs up if you've got a question for Sabrina. Come on. There must be somebody. I guess it's kind of lunchtime. People are eating their lunch. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, how did you decide on that reward paradigm?
So are you talking about the humor rewards task?
Yeah, with the funny cartoon versus the neutral cartoon.
Okay, so this was previously validated by Sherdell et al. They're a group who created this. And the purpose of creating this new rewards task was that typically reward tasks use food or money, and food tends to have satiation effects, or it might depend on whether you're hungry or full, while monetary rewards have an inherent anticipatory effect. So even when they see money, it's not directly assessing whether they like the money, it's more what they're going to use with that money. So the point of the humor rewards task was they thought that humor is a good reward that helps you assess kind of a primary reward while also not having an inherent anticipatory kind of component. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And in addition to sorry, one more question, but in addition to the functional task, what other measures are you collecting in this data set?
That's a really good question. So this is a very big longitudinal study. We're assessing multiple things. So not just reward processing, we're also assessing stress, so HPA axis alterations. We're assessing social functioning, emotion recognition, and there's a number of exclusion criteria as well. So yeah, does that kind of, do you want to kind of know the controls? Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Good questions. Anyone else? One more question? No? Okay, that's okay. I am mindful of time, that it's probably most people's lunch hours as well, but that was a great presentation, Sabrina. That's going to be, I'll be very interested to see what the results are of that. Okay, so next up we'll have Helen share your screen and I'll introduce you. So go ahead and do that, Helen.
Okay, let me see.
Good. So I'll just introduce Helen real quick. So Helen Okoye is a third-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia School of Nursing. She's a registered nurse, midwife, and public health nurse educator. She holds a Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science degrees in nursing. She's an experienced clinical nurse practitioner and nurse educator. She has contributed to the advancement of nursing for many years, both diploma and baccalaureate nursing programs. She's a fellow of the West African College of Nursing and has been involved in outreach programs of the college in Southeast Nigeria. Her research interests are in the areas of maternal, child, and adolescent health. She has published articles, presented conference papers, and attended several conferences locally and internationally. She has a passion for making significant contributions in nursing locally and globally. Welcome, Helen. I'm very excited to see your presentation.
Thank you.
Great.
Can you see my screen? Can you see it?
What was that?
Can you see the screen I just shared? Is it there?
Yeah, it's up there.
Oh, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm Helen Okoye, and my topic this afternoon is intersecting social statuses, health inequities, and power dynamics in adolescent girls and young women's sexual and reproductive health risks and vulnerabilities in sub-Saharan Africa. So adolescence is a critical developmental stage marked by accelerated physiological, cognitive, and psychosocial changes, as well as predisposition to risk behaviors, including sexual risk. So sexual risk behavior among young people remain a public health challenge globally, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where sexual risk and adverse health outcomes continue to adversely affect the health and well-being of young people. So sexual risk and the adverse health outcomes remain high in sub-Saharan Africa compared to high-income countries, and adolescent girls and young women continue to bear a disproportionately higher burden of sexual and reproductive health issues. So in addition to disability-adjusted life years from HIV/AIDS, other sexual transmitted infections, unsafe abortions, early motherhood increases adolescent girls and young women's morbidity and mortality for maternal and child health deaths, So like when the adolescent pregnancy predisposes the mother and child to, disability and death, and when they get pregnant as adolescents, the higher risk of dropping out of school is high, and they encounter economic hardship and intergenerational cycles of poverty. So looking at high income and low income, like sub-Saharan African countries, you can see that adolescent fertility rate is quite high in sub-Saharan Africa and very low, lowest in Canada, and then highest in Mexico, talking about North America, but remains very high in sub-Saharan African countries. So the final report of the World Health Organization, Commission on the final report of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, has citing the awareness of multi-level determinants of risk behavior among adolescents, not just adolescents, in all age groups, and influence of social environment on health. So despite these multi-level influences on adolescent sexual and reproductive health, extant evidence indicates that the broader social structural factors have overriding influence on the other determinants as they determine opportunities and conditions that affect health and well-being. So they determine the health compromising and or health enhancing conditions in any context. So the social ecological framework has been increasingly applied in understanding sexual risk behavior among adolescents, but extant evidence indicates that these social structural factors have overriding influence over other level determinants. And again, influence of context and globalization continue to affect adolescent sexual and reproductive health in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, globalization continues to influence traditional social norms, and then social media and cross-cultural socialization continue to impact sexual risk behavior. So furthermore, like these social structural factors determine availability of resources, economic well-being of adolescents, family income, access to health and education, which continue to influence sexual risk behavior. In addition to this multi-level determinants, gender plays a very prominent role in adolescent sexual risks in sub-Saharan Africa, because women, are subjected to subordinating roles, gender roles, and boys and men are socialized as authoritative gender roles, and this influences women and girls' decision-making power, and they're not able to make decisions in matters of their sexuality. So gender norms do not act in isolation. They interact with other level factors to influence adolescent sexual risk behavior, because we have the structural forms of gender inequality that determine economic distribution, decision-making power. So women experience worse sexual health outcomes compared to boys, though they also have their own sexual health outcome, but it is worse for adolescent girls and young women. So despite the program of action articulated at the International Conference on Population and Development held in Cairo in Egypt in 1994 to promote sexual health outcomes for everyone, including adolescents, significant progress is yet to be made in many indicators of adolescent sexual health in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, the SDGs goals to promote gender equality, empower women, and ensure that no one is being left behind is yet to be realized in sub-Saharan Africa, as many indicators of adolescent sexual health remain very poor for many adolescents in conditions of marginalization and oppression. So I plan to, this is a proposal, I'm still working on my candidacy proposal. So this is kind of a proposal. So I plan to apply quantitative intersectional analysis to examine these structural factors. Although evidence is pointing to the structural influences on adolescent sexual health, but most times these mechanisms are examined as individual causal mechanisms, and the interaction that exists among these causal pathways remain understudied. So I intend to apply a quantitative intersectional analysis to examine these multi-level influences, particularly the structural level determinants. So I plan to nest the individual level determinants within different social positions, though this has been examined variously with qualitative studies, but it is limited at the population level because I plan to use national demographic and health surveys from selected sub-Saharan African countries. So using qualitative studies will not capture this intersectionality at the population level. So we want to look at adolescent groups who are enjoying multiplicative advantage compared to those who are marginalized and may be in conditions of oppression or marginalization. So this study will influence policies, programs, and the allocation of resources that will enhance equity, equality, and accountability in adolescent health in sub-Saharan Africa. So that is just the little I can present for now. I'm still working, it's a work in progress.
That's awesome. Thanks, Helen. You're covering a lot, which is incredible. That's, amazing. And also, I'm a nurse too, so I obviously appreciate that lens. So thanks for the presentation. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Any questions for Helen? Come on. Someone's got one. Okay, I'll start it off. Or sorry, is someone wanting to go? No? Okay, they chickened out. Helen, where, so you said quantitative analysis. Where are you going to get your data is my question. Like, are there data like repositories where you're planning on doing the research, or?
Yeah, actually, these demographic and health surveys are available at the DHS program organized by the United States Agency for International Development. In fact, I have access to the data. I've downloaded them. So yeah.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, that's not often where these quantitative studies have that lens of intersectionality. So I think that's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? No. Okay, fine. Well, everyone, again, we'll put everyone's Twitter handles and contact information on the website. So if you have questions that you think of later, or when you're a little less shy, then you can reach out to all our speakers. All right, so I think that last but not least is Laura. Hold on there. So Laura, if you can try and share your screen there, then we'll get going with your presentation.
It says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, let's see. Maybe we're not a co-host yet. Hold on. Where are you? Catherine, can you make? Oh yeah, she got you. Okay, great. Perfect. All right, so I'll just introduce Laura here. So Laura Pritchett is a graduate student in psychological and brain sciences at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She leverages techniques from network neuroscience and neuroendocrinology to explore how sex steroid hormones impact human brain function across hormonal transition periods. The goal of her research is to improve the utility of sex hormones as markers of vulnerability for neuropsychiatric and neurological disorders that are disproportionately skewed towards women. Additionally, Laura is passionate about women's health research and is an advocate for women's representation in STEM. So thanks for joining us all the way from California, Laura.
Great, thanks. Can everyone hear me and see my screen?
You're good.
Okay, great. So hello, my name is Laura Pritchett, and I am a fourth-year PhD student working with Dr. Emily Jacobs at the University of California. And so today I'm going to talk about our work applying dense sampling to reveal endocrine modulation of large-scale brain networks. So when I first started grad school, I was really interested in understanding how the menstrual cycle influences brain function. But after, scouring the literature, I found that there were quite a bit of inconsistencies and inconclusive results. And a large factor in that is that there are experimental hurdles to studying the 25 to 30 day human menstrual cycle. And so what brain imaging typically does is they'll compare, they'll bring women in at a couple times throughout their cycle and study how the brain looks under low hormone states in menses versus high hormone states such as ovulation. But as you can see, what that really does is it doesn't allow us to explore the transient fluctuations in sex hormones and leaves a lot of windows unexplored. And what we've seen recently in the past 5 years or so is this advent of dense sampling within brain imaging, where instead of, say, sampling 30 women 1 or 2 times, we sample less women over longer periods of time. And so I thought that would be a really unique way to leverage understanding the menstrual cycle on brain function. And so that's kind of what we did. We took a dense sampling approach to cover how all hormones across the whole menstrual cycle could influence the brain. And so we started the 28andMe project, where I volunteered to undergo venipuncture and brain imaging every day for 30 days straight to ask the question, how do transient fluctuations in sex hormones influence resting state or task-free functional connectivity, where functional connectivity is assessing the relationship between 2 pairs of brain regions and how they co-fluctuate in time across a resting state scan. And I'm not going to go into the methods there, but I'm happy to answer questions later. And so here are actually my hormone levels. I'm happy to be endocrinely normal. And so the first question that we asked, and this is in collaboration with Dr. Tyler Santander, is there a relationship between whole brain functional connectivity and sex hormone fluctuations across the cycle? So what we did was we regressed hormones against edgewise connectivity in the brain, and edges being the connection between 2 pairs of brain regions. And what we found was that as estradiol rises across the cycle, we see a positive association with coherence, such that higher estrogen was associated with global increases in whole brain coherence. And interestingly, we saw generally the opposite with progesterone. So as it rises halfway through in the second half of the cycle, there was a negative association with whole brain coherence. But we know that the brain is organized into these large-scale brain networks, and maybe many of you are familiar with these, including the default mode network, the somatomotor network, and the visual network. And so we wanted to now look at this from the lens of brain networks and understand how hormones might modulate those. So we asked, does estradiol drive variation in functional brain network topology? And we used time lag models because we scanned consecutively, and that really allowed us to explore new statistical approaches. And I'm going to specifically talk about one finding here within the default mode, which is highly active all the time, but especially during resting state scans. And what we found was that previous states of estradiol, so my estradiol the day before and the day before that, were significant at predicting current states of default mode within network connectivity. And so when we added that into the model, no longer were previous states of the brain predicting current states of the brain, and instead estradiol was a really good modulator of that. And we see that really strongly near the ovulatory window, which is something we wanted to explore further. Importantly to note, we see this in a handful of resting state networks, including the control and the dorsal attention network, all of which these findings were replicated a year later when I did the same study again. And so that was looking at macro scale functional organization, applying functional anatomical networks a priori. And so we wanted to do a little bit more of a data-driven approach. And so in collaboration with Josh Mueller and Jean Carlson at my university, we wanted to zoom in and assess this relationship at the mesoscale level, toggling those intermediate spatial and temporal scales. And we did that with dynamic community detection, which provides an interpretable summary of strongly connected nodes of regions and seeing whether they transiently but significantly change across the cycle in ways that averaging within a session couldn't really pick up on, which is what we had done previously. So now we can really specifically ask where and when was estradiol having this effect in the brain. And so our first question was, when do community structures undergo reorganization, communities being sets of nodes? And I'm going to show you this graph here, and at the top is flexibility, which is just a measure of how often a node changes community affiliation. It is a hallmark of between network integration and really important for reorganization. And at the bottom, you have my hormone levels, and those are mapped by day of experiment. That's important to note. And so what we saw was a reorganization event, the biggest one, across the 3-day ovulatory window, where there was network flexibility increases. And we also saw this, interestingly, on day 9 of the experiment, when there was the secondary mid-luteal peak in estradiol. And I like to place these two graphs together, because you can really start to see how changes in brain metrics really map on with changes in sex hormones. And so despite a large degree of stability over the cycle within these communities, and I think that's important to note, 2 reorganization events, the only 2 we saw, took place coincident with peaks in estradiol in the mid-luteal phase and during ovulation. And so where does this reorganization take place over and above just knowing which networks are involved and maybe sensitive to estradiol, which regions specifically? Because I feel like that has really strong implications for our understanding of the brain and some clinical questions. And so now I've plotted the flexibility metrics by cycle stage on the brain using just a standard atlas. And what we found was that a group of prefrontal nodes belonging to a subnetwork of the default mode were the most sensitive and the ones that reorganized during ovulation, specifically in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is pretty interesting because we know that that's an area exquisitely sensitive to sex steroid hormones. This is a lot of John Morrison's work looking at non-human primates, where they characterized and found that about 50% of the pyramidal neurons in the prefrontal cortex express estrogen receptors. So that's kind of an exciting area, finding an area to further explore. So to conclude, endogenous hormone fluctuations across the complete menstrual cycle, have a robust impact on intrinsic brain network properties that may be overlooked by traditional approaches, including cross-sectional or sparse sampling designs, and additionally, our analytic choices that we make. And since this is a women's brain health series, I want to end with saying, understanding how sex hormones influence the human brain and human brain function is imperative for our basic understanding of the brain in both sexes, but especially for women's health. This is a natural feature of half the world's population. And so what our lab likes to say is free the cycle, don't flee the cycle. It's a really interesting variable to consider. And with that, I just want to thank my team, especially my advisor, Dr. Emily Jacobs, and I can answer any questions anyone has.
That was awesome. Thanks, Laura. This is fascinating work. All right, does anyone have questions at all?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question.
Go ahead.
That was great, Laura. Thanks so much. So I was wondering if just overall, how much reliability there is of hormones between different cycles within an individual, and if there's any sort of differences that you observed. One, I guess obviously in the second year with the hormone or with the oral contraceptives, it'd be different, but just across an individual, if different cycles are reliable.
Yeah, great question. Hey, Alicia. Yes, that is a really critical point to bring up. There is within person variability by cycle stage, as you know, almost as much as maybe, I don't know how strong of a claim, but as with between individuals and their cycles. So ideally, I would have done this over several cycles consecutively to see. We know that sometimes cycles are anovulatory. Sometimes the follicular stage is variable in how many days it is. So that's something to consider. And so this is just representative of one cycle, but the strong counter to that is, as you said, I did this a second time in the summer where I was placed on an oral contraceptive regimen that selectively suppressed my progesterone and not my estrogen, because it was such a low dose estradiol. And so that had, you know, high estrogen days, just similar, you know, to my ovulatory levels in the first study. And that showed to replicate our findings. Whether or not that's consistent across, if I looked at, you know, 12 cycles in a row, I'm not sure, but that is certainly an important factor to take into consideration. And, you know, maybe certain people have not as high peaks in estradiol, maybe that will lead to different conclusions as well.
Great, thanks so much. And it's great to hear that like you observed something similar like in the spike in the next summer as well, because that says a lot. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a fun. We were definitely excited to see the power of that.
Definitely. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Anyone else?
Hi. Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the research, and I was wondering whether you were envisioning in the next steps for using this dense sampling type of method with functional measures, such as regarding the measures to look at affective processes, for example, which is extremely relevant in terms of clinical implications. So yeah, I was wondering whether you had envisioned this for future work.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So far, I've just been in the depths of resting state, but if I'm understanding your question correctly, looking at task-based functional measures, absolutely. We've got some on deck. I did a reward task, similar to kind of Sabrina's of looking at food and other rewarding stimuli, as well as a selective attention task. So more in the cognitive domain, maybe not assessing affective yet for my data set, but that's in the cards. But we are trying to use dense sampling in other situations across other women on different oral contraceptives and in pregnancy and in men. And so we could apply some really relevant task-based measures that could pick up on affective disorders, especially maybe for those that suffer from premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and maybe looking at a task that taps into the depression circuitry, something like that. That's definitely on our mind, and I would love to look more into that because I think it could be fruitful.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking exactly of the premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and yeah, I think there's a lot of future space to do your kind of dense sampling methods that we needed so far in research.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter Schmidt and is kind of hit home the fact that these changes in hormones are really important for those affective disorders. So to be able to capture that would be powerful.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Probably have one more question if anyone has another last one. Anybody? No. One more second. I would like to leave a little bit of space. Just taking a second to think about it. All right. If not, that's great. That was an incredible presentation, and so many of these research projects, I think are just in the infancy of their state, like not necessarily in the project, but in what it could mean and what could be done with it is so exciting. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone. And we'll just say a quick, I'll just do a really quick little plug for, we're still looking for trainees, which would be great, out of the health cluster for the tri-cluster research day coming up here. And that's It's in November, but basically so October 13th is the last day to submit your abstract, and then the top 10 abstracts will be chosen to do a short oral presentation, and I believe that's on November 4th. And so far there's only a few actually that have been submitted, so your chances are good, and it can be an abstract that you've used for something else, or whether it's your graduate work or thesis work, but just something that you want to share, you want to do some knowledge translation on. So that goes in for the 13th, and I think, Catherine, am I forgetting anything else? Just thank you so much for everyone for showing up, and also definitely reach out to us. We're happy to have repeat offenders. If people want to come again with a different topic, or an update of a topic that they've worked on and now maybe you have some new results, or you want, like, that's totally fine too. So definitely just reach out to us, or if you have anyone that you think you would know that would want to do this. We'll probably do another one we've been every couple months usually, so it's not an exact date necessarily, but we'll probably plan one, maybe one more before Christmas sort of thing. So just definitely reach out to myself or the Women's Health Cluster email, or Catherine, or anyone that any one of those will send you in the right direction. So Catherine, am I forgetting anything?
No, you did great.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks again to all our speakers, and we actually are finished on time, which is, I'm a little surprised by. But thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.